And now what we're going to do is introduce a series of 3 speakers. Each one will independently present their own report about ESG-related issues, and then the 3 of them are going to sit together and discuss amongst themselves and take questions from you. Our first speaker is Elodie Timmermans, Senior Manager of Climate Change and Sustainability Services at Ernst & Young. Elodie works with global companies to help them develop strategic goals and objectives related to sustainability issues and to enhance the effectiveness of their non-financial reporting. Elodie, if you would join me on the podium.
Thank you to the BBB for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to present the latest EY research on non-financial information reporting called Is Your Non-Financial Performance Revealing the True Value of Your Business to Investors? So this is the 3rd report that EY has done around looking at perspectives of investors as it comes to reporting on ESG information. We have about 320 investors that have responded to our survey, answering to several questions as it comes to how are companies reporting on non-financial information, is the information useful for investors, and are investors making decisions based on that information. Before I go into details and showing the different responses to the different questions, I thought it would be useful to share with you the main results coming out of that survey. First, investors around the world are supporting ESG disclosures. I think that that's something that's important to emphasize because oftentimes we think that investors are maybe not looking at that information, but based on the survey and the information received, investors are looking at that information. They just think that the risks and the opportunities associated to that have been neglected and that the governance around it is needed. Second item is that the risk of the stranded assets is a substantive concern for stakeholders. So thinking about it, more than 60% of the survey respondents said that they had either decreased their holdings or were thinking of decreasing their holdings over the next 12 months because of the risk of stranded assets. The third item is that the recent scandals that have led investors to reevaluate non-financial disclosures, recent scandals have led investors to look at ESG in a sharper way, looking at what are companies actually doing from an environmental and social perspective, how are they managing those risks, but also managing the opportunities coming with it. The interesting thing was there's a challenge for investors because non-financial information has played a role by investors in making their decisions, but they also note that there is a challenge in the information provided, making it difficult for them to implement structural or formal processes to take ESG into consideration when making those decisions. And then last but not least, investors also noted that companies are reporting on their sustainability or non-financial performances because either of regulations, as some countries do have regulations in place, or because of demands from customers and not demands from others, from other stakeholders. So I thought that was interesting by setting the tone on what the details of the results will be, because it shows that there are some contradictions and it is difficult for investors to completely take into account ESG information. So the first questions we did ask investors was if they would agree with the 4 ESG themes that were mentioned in the Larry Fink memo of beginning of 2016. So those were our ESG issues. Do ESG issues have real and quantifiable impacts on the long term? Generating sustainable returns over time will require a sharper focus on ESG. Environmental and social issues have not been considered as part of the businesses. And then finally, CEOs should lay a long-term board review strategy every year. And by looking at those 4 statements and what investors were expecting, we see that about 80% of the investors agreed with those statements. And so even for investors that are remaining skeptical when it comes to the ESG disclosures, it is commonly understood that environmental and social risks can have a material impact on companies' benefits and profits. But it's also important to remember that while we focus a lot on the risks, focusing on ESG information can lead to opportunities for companies. And by managing those environmental and social aspects, companies can create more value for their companies, but also for their stakeholders. And that has been shown in different reports that have been published over the last few years. We asked the question over the last 3 years to different investors if non-financial information has played a role in investments and decision making. And what we can see is that above 60% of the investors responded that it occasionally or frequently played a role. And the item that I think is the most important is that the occasionally bucket has significantly increased, and the bucket about never, that 5%, that's a very small number of people. So it does mean that ESG is being taken into account and does play a role more and more for investors when they're looking at companies they are investing in. That said, the challenge for investors, as we heard it during the survey and the responses, are that to the question, are companies disclosing ESG risks and that could affect their current business models? 80% of the companies basically answered no, with 60% asking for more disclosures. So there seems to be a gap between what companies are reporting in their integrated reports, sustainability reports, on their websites, or other questionnaires they're filling in. There's a gap between that information that is published and the information that investors are asking companies to report on. And so the question is how to address that. And to further support that information, we can see that it's interesting to see that the gap between the 16% of investors that believe that ESG is not material, is not going to have a material impact on companies, against the 80% of the other investors mentioning that yes, it will have an impact, or it probably could have an impact, but that 80% has the challenge of the information that they are looking at. It's either not consistent or not comparable across the different countries, the different companies within an industry, and how to take good decisions based on that information and the stories that are told by the companies. This leads also to the discussion that I mentioned earlier about that some of the so the investors believe that companies are reporting on ESG because of legal or regulatory requirements as well as demands from customers. And only at the third place comes the response to investors' requests. And so that gap creates also the information gap that is requested from investors by the companies or what is requested by the other stakeholders. And this creates a very challenging situation for companies also because they do have a lot of requirements from the different stakeholders with asking different types of disclosures because of different material aspects depending on who the stakeholders are. That said, I think this slide shows the importance of ESG and how ESG is being taken into account by the different investors. And ask the questions if what types of information could impact your decisions. Investors mentioned that basically the key things were that the risk of poor governance and human rights in operations would lead investors to either reconsider their investments or withdraw their investments for companies, which basically means that it is really important for companies to have good strategies and better performances when it comes to their ESG information. And that's where the circle comes is that to be able to report to their stakeholders, companies will have to manage and have programs in place to be able to gather that information for the different material items and start reporting on it. But the problem is, to report, you need to be able to manage, and managing and reporting will lead companies to set up better programs and become more sustainable. So to summarize, and I think, as mentioned earlier, ESG information is evolving and it's incorporating more topics now. It's not just about the greenhouse gas emissions or your water use emissions. Water use, it's all about being better at linking that information and those targets with societal expectations, changing demographics, climate change, water scarcity. So being able to tell a full story to your investors or the investors. So looking at, okay, this is the targets for the company are, the progress against those targets, and what does it mean for the different stakeholders, and how would that impact the investors and the performances on a longer term. To finalize, I think, so the EY report shows the different options of what companies can do to respond to those demands from stakeholders and investors specifically. First, meeting investors' expectations and engaging with them. So looking at what we mentioned earlier, looking at that longer term version and looking at what are the different processes in place to address the different risks and mitigate those from an environmental and social and governance perspective. How do you take a long-term view, and how do you inform about those? But then not just informing them, but also taking it into perspective of the mega trends, and how does it fit within the bigger picture. Second item is also being more connected, and how thinking about being connected with the different stakeholders, especially investors, and providing them with the information that they're looking at, and looking at what are the key environmental, social, and governance risks, as well as opportunities, and focusing on what is truly material for the company. And then last but not least, while focusing on the material items, making sure to give the right focus on governance around the data and the quality of the data, and not just focusing on just the qualitative information, but quantitative and qualitative information to be able to tell the full story to your stakeholders and your investors, and making sure that they will be able to have all the information needed when making decisions. And so controls and reviews of that information is very important to be sure to be consistent. And I'll just finish with the last statistics that coming out of the report was mentioned, is that investors would expect the boards and audit committee members to have more governance in place as it comes to the non-financial information data, making sure that it is useful and taken into account from a full perspective.